you know. I mean, just recently they verified the Shroud of Turin. Have you seen that?
I've been reading about it, and I know that there's some contention, there's some discussion and debate about it, but they used to think that it was only a couple hundred years old.
Yeah.
And now they've changed that.
Yeah, they said.
For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has captivated historians, scientists, and theologians alike. Some believe it to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, while skeptics dismiss it as a medieval forgery. But in a shocking turn of events, new scientific evidence suggests that the shroud may indeed date back to the time of Christ, reigniting one of the most fascinating debates in religious history. Even more intriguing is that Hollywood icon Mel Gibson and podcast giant Joe Rogan recently delved into this topic, expressing astonishment at the latest findings. They discussed how modern science is struggling to explain how the image on the shroud was formed, the physical evidence that matches biblical descriptions of Jesus' crucifixion, and how pollen samples, fabric structure, and even the placement of ancient coins over the eyes further authenticate its historical legitimacy. Their conversation didn't stop there. They also explored other ancient mysteries, such as the Ark of the Covenant, and the eerie connection between Golgotha, the site of Jesus' crucifixion, and the burial place of Adam's skull. These ideas might sound like something out of a movie, but they are deeply rooted in historical and biblical traditions. Before we dive into these fascinating revelations, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Now, let's uncover the shocking truth about the Shroud of Turin. Mel Gibson wasted no time in expressing his excitement about the latest developments regarding the shroud. You know, just recently, they verified the Shroud of Turin. Have you seen that? He asked Rogan, who was already familiar with the long-standing controversy. Rogan, who has always approached religious topics with skepticism but curiosity, admitted he had been reading about it. They used to think that it was only a couple hundred years old, and now they've changed that, he acknowledged. For years, radiocarbon dating results suggested the shroud was a medieval artifact, dating only as far back as the 13th or 14th century. However, new studies indicate that the sample used in the earlier tests came from a portion of the shroud that had been repaired in the Middle Ages. Recent analysis, using more advanced techniques, now suggests the linen itself dates back to the 1st century AD, aligning with the time of Christ.
Well, it would mean that the radiocarbon dating of the shroud would have dated a contaminated sample that would mean that the radiocarbon date was incorrect.
But what truly baffles scientists isn't just the age of the fabric. It's the image itself. The faint, almost ghostly depiction of a man on the cloth isn't made from any known paint, dye, or pigment. Instead, it appears to be a scorch-like imprint, one that some scientists believe could have been created by an intense burst of light or radiation. Gibson was fascinated by this idea. They don't understand how it was made, he said. It's not paint. They don't know what caused the image itself, and how that technology would have even been available back then. Rogan took this a step further. An intense light, atomic, to leave almost like a photographic imprint on a piece of cloth, he speculated, grasping for an explanation. This theory, that an otherworldly burst of energy may have imprinted the image onto the cloth, is eerily consistent with biblical descriptions of the resurrection of Christ. Could it be that the moment of Jesus' return to life was so powerful that it left a permanent mark on the shroud? If so, this would make the shroud the only physical artifact bearing direct evidence of the resurrection itself. Looking closely at the shroud, both Gibson and Rogan were struck by the anatomical details visible on the fabric. You can see that it depicts a 1st century Hebrew male because the hairstyle was from the 1st century, and a Hebrew hairstyle, Gibson pointed out. The man on the cloth appears to be around 6 feet tall, covered in wounds that match Roman crucifixion methods. Whip marks are visible across the back and legs, wounds on the wrists and feet align with the nails driven into Christ's body, and a puncture wound on the side corresponds with the spear thrust described in the Gospel of John. Rogan seemed particularly intrigued by the discovery of ancient pollen embedded in the cloth. The pollen they found in the cloth was from that region, Gibson confirmed, referring to the Middle Eastern plants that scientists have identified in the fabric. These botanical traces match species that existed in Judea around the time of Christ, further supporting the argument that the shroud is not a European medieval relic, but an authentic artifact from the 1st century. Then came another extraordinary claim, one that, if true, could provide even more concrete evidence of the shroud's authenticity. An archaeologist I knew who translated the Passion in Aramaic told me that if you look close, you can see the image of a Tiberius coin on the eyes, Gibson said. Rogan was taken aback. Really? Yeah, Gibson continued. They would put coins over the eyes of the dead, and the coins have the image of Tiberius. That would date it. Tiberius was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, and his coins were in circulation throughout the Roman Empire. If such an imprint is indeed present on the shroud, it would be nearly impossible for it to be a medieval forgery, as no 13th century artist could have known or replicated such a minute historical detail. From the shroud, the conversation took another fascinating turn, as Rogan brought up the Ark of the Covenant. He referenced historian Graham Hancock, who had investigated claims that the Ark might be hidden in a church in Ethiopia. They believe the Ark of the Covenant is in this one church that's protected by all these monks that wind up getting cataracts and radiation disease and sickness, Rogan explained. This detail caught Gibson's attention, and they think that it's because they're protecting this Ark of the Covenant, that it's an actual physical thing that's there, and if you touch it, you get zapped, Rogan continued. Could the Ark truly still exist somewhere in the world, hidden away and guarded? If so, why would it have such an effect on those who come near it? Some believe the Ark was constructed using materials that generated an electrical charge, while others argue that divine power radiates from it. Finally, the discussion took an even deeper theological turn when Gibson introduced a lesser-known biblical tradition, one that ties Jesus' crucifixion site to the very first man, Adam. You know, they say that Golgotha, the place where the crucifixion happened, it's called Golgotha, the place of the skull, because that's where Adam's head is buried, Gibson revealed. Rogan was stunned. Really? Yes, Gibson continued, and that it's all perhaps the same place. It tells you it's kind of in the same area where Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac. This idea, found in both Jewish and Christian traditions, suggests that Adam's skull was buried beneath the very spot where Christ was crucified, symbolizing that Jesus, as the second Adam, came to redeem humanity from the fall of the first man. In some artistic depictions of the crucifixion, a skull is shown at the base of the cross, representing Adam's remains beneath Golgotha. Despite all the evidence, the Shroud of Turin remains one of the most debated artifacts in history. Scientists are still trying to understand how the image was formed, and while skeptics continue to challenge its authenticity, the weight of historical and forensic evidence increasingly suggests that it could be real. What does this mean for faith, history, and science? Is the shroud a divine relic proving the resurrection, or is it simply an extraordinary historical enigma? Either way, as Joe Rogan and Mel Gibson's conversation shows, The mystery of the Shroud of Turin is far from solved.